in the desert, under the endless heat of the Texas sun. Secrets were buried. For years, people spoke about the Brennan Ranch as if it were cursed, a place of beauty and blood, of dreams and betrayal. Louise Brennan, once a woman with a vision to create a sanctuary for animals, had vanished without a trace. Her disappearance left behind only whispers, broken cages, and the shadow of a lion named Samson, a beast whose story was tied to hers in ways no one could have imagined. For decades, the truth lay hidden beneath concrete and lies, a story of greed, of power, and of the desperate fight for survival. But as the years passed, the truth began to claw its way back to the surface. This isn't just the story of a murder. It's the story of resilience, of a lion who refused to die, of a daughter who refused to stop searching, and of a legacy that proved love is the fiercest animal of all. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the world's most gripping mysteries. And if you find stories like this important, give this video a like. It really helps us share these truths with more people. When investigators first arrived at the ranch, they were struck by its strange stillness. Dust and silence covered everything, as though time itself had abandoned the place. The structures were worn, the fences rusting. But in the middle of all that decay, something lingered. A weight, a presence, the feeling that this land still had a story to tell. It began with Louise Brennan's dream, a dream to save wild animals from captivity and give them freedom in the desert. She called it Samson's Haven, named after the lion she loved most. To her, Samson wasn't just a wild creature. He was family. She believed he was proof that broken things could be healed. But where Louise saw hope, others saw money. Traffickers, circus owners, and roadside zoos, all part of a network of cruelty that treated animals as commodities. And at the center of this dark world was Bobby Nash, a man whose greed knew no limits. Louise stood in his way. And in 1992, she vanished. Her plane was later found, wrecked and buried in the desert, her body trapped beneath concrete. But for her daughter, Lily, the story didn't end there. Lily was only a child when her mother disappeared. She grew up haunted by questions no one seemed willing to answer. For years, she carried fragments of her mother's journals, scribbled notes about Samson and the sanctuary. And in those words, Lily found the strength to keep searching. The story of Louise Brennan wasn't over. It was waiting for Lily to uncover it. By the early 2000s, whispers of corruption and trafficking began to surface. Hidden facilities, secret shipments, and animals moved like contraband across state lines. Every trail seemed to circle back to Bobby Nash. But Bobby was careful. He had connections, money, and an uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of the law. Witnesses who spoke out often recanted. Evidence went missing. And all the while his fortune grew. Yet there was one thing he could never quite bury: the story of Samson. Samson wasn't just a lion. To Louise, he was the soul of her sanctuary. To Bobby, he became a reminder of what he had taken and what he could never control. Neighbors remembered hearing the lion's roar echoing across the desert at night, long after Louise was gone. Some said Bobby kept Samson as a trophy. Others believed the lion had been killed years ago. But no one could say for sure. For Lily, the unanswered question of Samson was as heavy as the truth about her mother. She would later describe it in interviews. I felt like if I could find out what happened to him, I would understand what really happened to her. And so, the years passed. Lily grew older. The ranch fell into ruin. But the story refused to die. In 2010, investigators reopened the case. Forensic teams began to dig. And beneath the cracked concrete of the desert floor, they found what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades: the remains of Louise Brennan's plane, and with it, the undeniable proof of murder. But alongside tragedy came hope. Journals, hidden in sealed containers, survived. Louise's words, fragile but powerful, spoke of her bond with Samson. She wrote of how he trusted her completely, how he made a deep rumbling sound whenever she approached, a sound not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something in between. It was in those pages that Lily discovered her mother's truth. Rescue wasn't about one life saving another. It was about 2 souls agreeing to hope together. Those words would later become the guiding principle for everything Lily built. But in 2010, they were also a haunting reminder that her mother's dream had been stolen and that Bobby Nash had been the thief. The walls were beginning to close in on him. Federal investigators were now following the money, the animals, and the missing people tied to the trafficking network. The case was unraveling, and at the center of it all was still one question. What really happened to Samson? The search for answers grew darker as investigators pieced together the fragments of Louise Brennan's life. Her dream sanctuary, Samson's Haven, had been designed to protect animals from exploitation. But in her absence, it had become the very thing she feared most, a holding ground for smuggling, a pit stop in a network of cruelty. Agents interviewed former employees, neighbors, even truck drivers who had once delivered supplies to the ranch. Over and over, one name surfaced, Bobby Nash. He was described as charming, intimidating, and ruthless. Some said he could buy a man's silence with cash. Others claimed he could steal it with fear. But one story stood out. A ranch hand remembered sneaking into the sanctuary at night, long after Louise had disappeared. He swore he heard the unmistakable sound of a lion's roar. He said Samson was still alive, caged, restless, and angry. It wasn't just a roar, the man explained years later. It was pain, like he knew he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. If true, that meant Bobby hadn't just taken Louise's life. He had imprisoned the very symbol of her sanctuary. The idea haunted Lily. For her, Samson represented more than just an animal. He was a living echo of her mother's love, a reminder that hope could survive even in captivity. She began pushing investigators harder, demanding answers not only about her mother's death, but about the fate of the lion. In 2012, a breakthrough came. Federal agents raided a property connected to Nash. Hidden behind steel gates and barbed wire, they found a collection of exotic animals, bears, tigers, and birds of prey. Many were malnourished, some close to death. The cruelty was undeniable, but Samson wasn't there. The disappointment was crushing. Still, the raid proved what many had long suspected. Bobby Nash had built an empire of exploitation, using wealth and intimidation to keep his crimes buried. But the ground beneath him was shifting. Whispers of betrayal began to surface within his own circle. Associates who once kept quiet were now speaking to authorities. Old ledgers revealed cash transactions and coded entries. And among those records, one note appeared again and again. Was it Samson or something else entirely? For Lily, it was enough to reignite her determination. She believed that if Samson was alive, he was the last witness to her mother's life, and maybe in some way, the last piece of her mother's soul. The hunt wasn't just for justice anymore. It was for closure. And as the investigation tightened, Bobby Nash began to show cracks. By 2013, Bobby Nash was no longer untouchable. For years, he had built walls around himself, walls of money, influence, and silence. But now, those walls were crumbling. Federal indictments loomed. Former allies turned informants. Each testimony chipped away at the empire he had built. They described backroom deals, bribes to inspectors, and animal shipments that bypassed every law in the book. Still, when asked about Louise Brennan, Bobby denied everything. To him, she was just a woman who had run off and abandoned her little fantasy. The arrogance in his words only deepened the anger of those still fighting for her memory. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Investigators searching an abandoned storage facility found a crate. Inside were old photographs, documents, and recordings, trophies Bobby had kept from his decades in the trade. Among them was a grainy videotape. The footage was chilling. It showed a lion, gaunt and restless, pacing in a narrow cage. The date stamped on the corner of the video was 1995, 3 years after Louise's disappearance. The lion had a distinctive scar across his muzzle. It was Samson. For Lily, the sight was devastating. Samson had survived, but in captivity, stripped of the freedom her mother had promised him. The video was proof that Bobby hadn't just destroyed her mother's dream. He had twisted it, turning the symbol of her sanctuary into a prisoner. But the footage did something else, too. It gave investigators leverage. Now they had proof that Bobby Nash was directly tied to Samson long after Louise's death. And with that connection came new charges, not only for trafficking, but for unlawful possession of protected species. The noose was tightening. Still, one question remained unanswered. What had become of Samson? Some believed he had been sold to another collector. Others whispered that he had been killed when he grew too difficult to control. But Lily refused to accept those answers. For her, Samson wasn't just a lion. He was the last piece of her mother's legacy. And she vowed that no matter how long it took, she would find out what happened to him. The stage was set. Bobby Nash was cornered. The empire of lies was collapsing. And in the middle of it all stood the ghost of a lion whose roar still echoed in the desert night. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches. Victims of Nash's trafficking empire waited with clenched fists, and federal agents stood guard along the walls. For years, Bobby Nash had been a ghost in the justice system, always slipping through cracks, always a step ahead. But this time, the cracks were sealed shut. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimonies, the videotape of Samson. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a portrait of a man who believed himself untouchable. And then came the most haunting testimony of all. A former associate of Nash, nervous and trembling, told the jury about a night in the late 1990s. He claimed Bobby had bragged about owning a lion he had taken from some bleeding heart woman who thought she could save the world. The courtroom fell silent as the witness described the animal's cage, the chains, the way Bobby laughed about feeding time. For Lily, sitting in the gallery, the words cut like knives. But they also brought something else. Clarity. At last, there was no denying the truth. Samson had been real, alive, and suffering long after her mother's disappearance. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty on multiple counts: trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Bobby Nash was sentenced to life without parole. For many, the case was over. Justice had been served. But for Lily, it wasn't finished, because Bobby never revealed what had become of Samson. When pressed by investigators, he smirked. When asked directly in court, he shrugged. And when Lily herself sent him a letter begging for the truth, the only reply he gave was 3 words: "Ask the desert." The phrase became a haunting riddle. What did it mean? Was Samson buried somewhere in the sands of Texas? Was he sold, caged, or set free to fend for himself? The mystery kept gnawing at Lily. She knew that without answers, her mother's story and Samson's would never truly rest. So, even after Bobby Nash was locked away, Lily began her own search. She walked the old grounds of Samson's Haven, now nothing more than rusting fences and crumbling barns. She followed rumors from old workers, hunters, and travelers. Every roar of a distant animal felt like it could be him. And then, one day, she found something. The weeks after the trial felt like standing in the wreckage of a storm. Newspapers ran headlines about the downfall of Bobby Nash. Lawmakers debated new wildlife protection laws, and activists called it a turning point in the fight against trafficking. But for Lily, none of that filled the silence that came at night. Justice had been served. Yes, but closure? That remained as elusive as ever. She returned often to the land where her mother had once dreamed of building the sanctuary. The earth was dry, the old barns collapsed, the fences twisted by rust. It was not a place of life, but of echoes. And yet, Lily kept walking those grounds, listening for something more than wind. "Ask the desert," Bobby had said. The words lodged in her mind like a splinter. She thought of her mother, of Samson, of everything lost in that barren stretch of land. The desert was where Bobby had buried his secrets, and Lily intended to dig them all up. She began retracing Bobby's movements, visiting the towns where his trucks had once stopped, speaking with men who had long since abandoned his service but carried shadows in their eyes. Most claimed they knew nothing. Some looked away, fearful of ghosts that still carried Bobby's name. But one old ranch hand, drunk on cheap whiskey, muttered something that made her blood freeze. "I seen him once," he said, staring at the dirt between his boots. "Lion. Couldn't walk right. Bobby had him in the back, chained up like a dog. Said he was keeping him for her." "For who?" Lily asked, her voice breaking. The man shrugged. The dead woman, said the lion was the only part of her that hadn't left. That night, Lily sat in her truck, trembling. The image of her mother's lion, crippled but alive, chained in some dark corner of Bobby's empire, burned into her mind. If Samson had survived the bullet, if Bobby had kept him hidden, where was he now? The desert held its silence. The search stretched on for years, until silence was all Lily came to expect. But silence has a way of breaking, sometimes when you least expect it. The land her mother once dreamed of didn't stay empty forever. With the money from court settlements, donations from animal rights groups, and grants that followed the Nash conviction, the sanctuary finally rose from dust. Not in her mother's lifetime, but in her daughter's. Samson's Haven, they named it, not as a memorial to tragedy, but as a promise. The first residents arrived on a covered dawn. 2 tigers rescued from a roadside zoo in Oklahoma, their paws raw from concrete, their ribs pressing against striped fur. Then came 3 bears from a bankrupt circus, bewildered by open sky after years beneath canvas. The sanctuary filled, acre by acre, with creatures who had never known freedom but would now learn something close to it. And always, Lily felt her mother there, in the creak of the new wooden gates, in the carved stone marker that bore Louise's words. Every life saved matters to that life. On the anniversary of her mother's death, Lily walked to the place where the graves lay side by side, one marked with name, the other with silence. She sat between them, reading aloud from what survived of Louise's journals. Samson trusts me completely now, makes that rumbling sound when I approach. I think we save each other daily. Me from cynicism, him from fear. That's what rescue really is. Not one saving another, but 2 souls agreeing to hope together. Her voice cracked. The wind carried the words across the ranch, across 20 years of silence, across species and death and justice finally served. And somewhere far from there, in a cage smaller than the ones he had once built, Bobby Nash sat counting days. Somewhere else, Helen Nash lived under another name, her blood money cold comfort in witness protection. Somewhere in the federal system, dozens of traffickers awaited justice of their own. But here, in this desert, a daughter built something beautiful out of something unspeakably broken. That, Lily realized, was her mother's truest legacy. Not the rescue itself, but the belief that rescue was always possible, even 20 years late, even from the grave. 5 years passed. The sanctuary had grown. The education center opened its doors, children arriving by the busload to learn about conservation. On a spring morning, Lily stood at the gates to welcome a group of 3rd graders from Austin. Their teacher whispered that they had studied the Louise Brennan case in their ethics class. Among them was Isabella, Miguel's granddaughter, now 17 and fierce in her convictions. She ran up, breathless. "The new rescue's here," she said, pointing toward the transport truck rumbling up the gravel drive. Inside was an elderly lion, thin, scarred, dignity etched into every weary line of his body. The paperwork called him Rex, taken from a defunct roadside zoo in Louisiana. But when Lily looked into his eyes, her breath caught that particular gold. She whispered, almost without sound, "Hello, old friend." The crate door opened slowly. The lion stepped out, arthritic and hesitant, his ribs faint beneath his hide, his gait stiff as if the earth itself resisted his weight. Yet there was something in the way he lifted his head, something in the way his gaze swept the horizon. Dr. Sarah Chun, the sanctuary's veterinarian, crouched beside him with her instruments. "He's ancient," she murmured, wonder softening her clinical tone. "Maybe 25. Declawed, teeth filed. And look here," she held up the x-ray. Scars consistent with an old gunshot wound. Bullet fragments lodged near the spine. Lily froze. Gunshot. Spine. It couldn't be. Sarah continued. By all rights, he should have been paralyzed. Maybe he was for a time, but somehow he healed. Someone must have kept him alive. The lion turned his head then, slowly, and his eyes locked with Lily's. Eyes she had only seen in faded photographs and her mother's descriptions. That gold, deep and steady, as if carrying the desert within them. Her heart stuttered. Run the DNA. she said, her voice sharp against the hush. Compare it to the evidence from the case, to the hair samples, to the journals. 3 days later, the results arrived. Positive. It was Samson. Impossible, but true. Miguel, now stooped with age, listened to the news without surprise. I always wondered, he said, his weathered hands folded. Bobby came back from the desert with bones to bury, said they were Samson's. But there was another lion in quarantine that died the same week. Same size, same color. He switched them. Your mother was gone, but Samson he couldn't kill. Lily could hardly breathe. The weight of it pressed into her bones. Samson, her mother's lion, the soul she thought lost to the sands, had survived. But the greater question lingered. Why? The answer came not from records, but from Samson himself. She spent hours with him, sitting outside the enclosure as he rested. He was too old to be dangerous, too tired to fear. Sometimes, when she read aloud from her mother's journals, he would rumble deep in his chest, that sound between a purr and a growl. One evening, she brought her mother's jacket, kept in storage for decades, the fabric faint with a scent that memory alone preserved. The moment Samson caught it, everything in him changed. He pressed against the fence, straining, desperate. A sound poured out of him, broken, longing, filled with recognition. You remember her, Lily whispered, tears blurring her vision. After all this time, you remember. She broke protocol, stepped into the enclosure. The lion pressed his head against her, against the jacket, against the years between them. The miracle wasn't survival. The miracle was memory. Later that week, while cataloging old case evidence in the sanctuary's small archive, Lily found a cardboard box pushed behind a shelf. The label was faint, almost rubbed away, but inside were a stack of VHS tapes. Each bore the same unmistakable scrawl in black marker, Bobby's handwriting. On the first tape, dated 1992, the camera shook before settling on Bobby himself, younger, leaner, his eyes cold but restless. He was speaking to someone off camera. He's healing, Bobby muttered. Won't ever walk right. Spine's ruined. Lou would want him alive, though. Damned if I know why. Every time he looks at me, it's like she's staring through him, judging me. Should put him down. Can't. He's all that's left of her that isn't buried under concrete. The frame shifted then, the lens catching the inside of a dimly lit cage. Samson lay there, gaunt, hind legs useless, but his eyes, those eyes, burned alive. Lily's chest tightened. Her hands trembled against the old plastic casing. The second tape was from 1998. Bobby's voice again, this time tinged with awe. He walked today. 10 years since I shot him, and the bastard walked. Lou always said he was a fighter. Damn woman was right. The screen showed Samson, unsteady but determined, taking a handful of halting steps across straw. Another tape, marked 2003. Had to move him again. Ford Zoo that's willing to keep him off the books for cash. 20 years old. Should be dead. Too stubborn. Just like her. And then the final tape. The date was only a month before Louise's plane had been found. Sending him to Louisiana. Getting too risky. 20 years of keeping her lion alive. Don't even know why anymore. Habit. Guilt. Doesn't matter. Tough old bastard will outlive me anyway. The tape clicked to black. Lily sat there in the dark, the worthy old player still humming in her ears. Bobby had shot Samson, yes, but he hadn't killed him. For reasons even he couldn't name, guilt, obsession, love twisted into cruelty. He had kept her mother's lion alive. Hidden, moved, traded, surviving in silence, even as Louise rotted under concrete. The realization pressed against Lily like a storm. Samson hadn't just lived. He had carried the weight of her mother's legacy, even in cages, even through pain. That night, she returned to his enclosure with something new, a cassette player, and a recording she had uncovered of her mother singing. Off-key lullabies she used to invent for the animals, silly and tender. When the sound filled the air, Samson's body changed. He pressed against the fence, calling out in response, a low, trembling roar. You survived it all, Lily whispered, tears streaming. The bullet, the cages, the years. You survived to come home. The sanctuary grew in reputation and reach. Word spread of the lion who had survived the impossible, the lion who had lived 2 lives, one in chains, one in freedom. Documentaries were made. Reporters came and went. But for Lily, Samson's days were not about spectacle. They were about presence. He was old now, his body worn and frail. Some days he ate well, others he refused food. Often he lay stretched in the sun, his sides rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Lily spent hours beside him, reading the journals, playing the recordings, letting memory knit together what time had torn apart. One afternoon, Isabella rushed in. "Miss Lily, the crew is here," for the 5-year retrospective. Lily had agreed, reluctantly. The sanctuary needed funding and attention brought donors. Still, she hated the thought of turning Samson into a headline. The interviewer was kind, but thorough. Bobby Nash was executed last year. "Did you attend?" Lily shook her head. "No. I was here, introducing 2 rescued tigers to their new habitat. Any regrets? That it took 20 years for justice. That my mother died thinking help was coming. That Samson spent decades in cages because Bobby couldn't finish what he started. But Samson survived. That's what matters." They filmed her with the old lion. He was thinner now, his coat dull, his breathing labored. The vet said weeks, maybe months. "Will you bury him with your mother?" the interviewer asked. "Yes," Lily answered softly. "He never left her side in life. I won't separate them in death." That evening, as the sun sank low, Lily sat with Samson in the dim light. His breath rattled, each one harder one than the last. She stroked the air just beyond the fence, whispering, "It's okay. You can go. You've waited long enough." Samson lifted his head, eyes of molten gold locking on hers. He made that sound, not quite a purr, not quite a growl, one final time. And then stillness. Lily stayed until midnight, her hand resting on the ground between them, refusing to move. When at last she rose, Miguel and the staff gathered. Together, they wrapped Samson's body with quiet dignity. At dawn, they buried him beside Louise. The staff stood in silence, joined by townspeople who had come to pay respects. Isabella read from Louise's journal. "Samson has taught me that love transcends species, that loyalty transcends circumstance, that some bonds are stronger than death. When he looks at me, I don't see an animal. I see a soul that chose to trust despite every reason not to. That's the miracle. Not the rescue itself, but the choosing to be rescued." As the soil closed over Samson's grave, a roar rose across the sanctuary. One lion, then another, then all of them, voices rising into the desert morning, a chorus of farewell. Lily felt the sound in her bones. They knew. They were saying goodbye to their elder, their survivor, their witness. Later, when the crowd had gone, Lily returned alone. She placed a new marker in the earth. Samson, 1975 to 2013. He came home. The sanctuary did not stop with Samson's passing. If anything, his story lit a fire that spread beyond the desert. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up in numbers they had never imagined. And schools across the state added field trips to Samson's Haven as part of their curriculum. The education center opened with her mother's photograph at the entrance. Etched into stone beneath it were her words, "Every life saved matters to that life." Thousands of children passed through each year, learning not only about conservation, but about ethics, compassion, and courage. The movement reached further. Laws were drafted, trafficking networks dismantled. The Nash Act became a model for international wildlife protection, stronger than anything that had come before it. What began in secrecy and blood ended in policy and progress. But for Lily, the victories were not in courtrooms or Congress halls. They were here, on the land her mother had dreamed of, between the graves where memory and love kept watch. A mother who chose a lion over a lie. A lion who chose loyalty over survival. A daughter who chose justice over comfort. Now, finally, all three were at peace. That evening, Lily walked the sanctuary's paths. Every enclosure had been transformed into wide spaces. Every animal safe, no longer behind bars, but within landscapes shaped to resemble the wild. She paused at Luna's pool, the white tiger who had been their first rescue. Old now, but still playful, Luna splashed in the water like a cub. "That's my girl," Lily whispered. "Play. You're safe now." Luna looked up at her and made the sound. Not quite a purr, not quite a growl. The same sound Samson had made all his life. The desert wind carried it across the sanctuary, through the trees, over the graves. A sound of love that transcended death, of loyalty that refused to be broken, of truth that had taken 20 years to surface, but, once freed, could never be buried again. Lily smiled, lifting her face to the fading sun. Some bonds death could not break. Some truths refused to stay hidden. Some loves transcended everything, time, species, even murder. In the end, that was Louise Brennan's greatest legacy. Not just a sanctuary, not just justice, but proof that love is the fiercest animal of all, and it always finds its way home. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please give a like and share it with someone who cares about justice and compassion. And don't forget to subscribe. We have more untold stories that deserve to be heard, just like this one.